Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We are continuing reading from Oliver Twist, starting with Chapter 21, The Expedition. It was a cheerless morning when they got into the street, blowing and raining hard, and the clouds looking dull and stormy. The night had been very wet, for large pools of water had collected in the road and the kennels were overflowing. There was a faint glimmering of the coming day in the sky, but it rather aggravated than relieved the gloom of the scene, the somber light only serving to pale that which the street lamps afforded, without shedding any warmer or brighter tints upon the wet housetops and dreary streets. There appeared to be nobody stirring in that quarter of the town, for the windows of the houses were all closely shut, and the streets through which they passed were noiseless and empty. By the time they had turned into the Bethnal Green Road, the day had fairly begun to break. Many of the lamps were already extinguished. A few country wagons were slowly toiling on toward London, and now and then a stagecoach covered with mud rattled briskly by, the driver bestowing as he passed an admonitory lash upon the heavy wagoner, who by keeping on the wrong side of the road had endangered his arriving at the office a quarter of a minute after his time. The public houses with gas lights burning inside were already open. By degrees, other shops began to be unclosed, and a few scattered people were met with. Then came straggling groups of laborers going to their work, then men and women with fish baskets on their heads, donkey carts laden with vegetables, chaise carts filled with livestock or whole carcasses of meat, milk women with pails, and an unbroken concourse of people trudging out with various supplies to the eastern suburbs of the town. As they approached the city, the noise and traffic gradually increased, and when they threaded the streets between Shoreditch and Smithfield, it had swelled into a roar of sound and bustle. It was as light as it was likely to be till night came on again, and the busy morning of half the London population had begun. Turning down Sun Street and Crown Street and crossing Finsbury Square, Mr. Sikes struck by way of Chiswell Street into Barbican, thence into Long Lane, and so into Smithfield, from which latter place arose a tumult of discordant sounds that filled Oliver Twist with surprise and amazement. It was market morning. The ground was covered nearly ankle deep with filth and mire, and a thick steam, perpetually rising from the reeking bodies of the cattle and mingling with the fog which seemed to rest upon the chimney tops, hung heavily above. All the pens in the center of the large area, and as many temporary ones as could be crowded into the vacant space, were filled with sheep. Tied up to posts by the gutter side were long lines of beasts and oxen, 3 or 4 deep. Countrymen, butchers, drovers, hawkers, boys, thieves, idlers, and vagabonds of every low grade were mingled together in a dense mass. The whistling of drovers, the barking of dogs, the bellowing and plunging of oxen, the bleating of sheep, the grunting and squeaking of pigs, the cries of hawkers, the shouts, oath, and quarreling on all sides, the ringing of bells, and the roar of voices that issued from every public house, the crowding, pushing, driving, beating, whooping, and yelling, the hideous and discordant din that resounded from every corner of the market, and the unwashed, unshaven, squalid, and dirty figures constantly running to and fro and bursting in and out of the throng, rendered it a stunning and bewildering scene which quite confounded the senses. Mr. Sikes, dragging Oliver after him, elbowed his way through the thickest of the crowd and bestowed very little attention on the numerous sights and sounds which so astonished the boy. He nodded twice or thrice to a passing friend, and resisting as many invitations to take a morning dram, pressed steadily onward until they were clear of the turmoil and had made their way through Hosier Lane into Holborn. "Now, young'un," said Sikes, looking up at the clock of St. Andrew's Church, "hard upon 7. You must step out. Come, don't lag behind already, lazy legs." Mr. Sikes accompanied this speech with a jerk at his little companion's wrist. Oliver, quickening his pace into a kind of trot between a fast walk and a run, kept up with the rapid strides of the housebreaker as well as he could. They held their course at this rate until they had passed Hyde Park Corner and were on their way to Kensington, when Sikes relaxed his pace until an empty cart, which was at some little distance behind, came up. Seeing Hounslow written on it, he asked the driver, with as much civility as he could assume, if he would give them a lift as far as Isleworth. "Jump up," said the man. "Is that your boy?" "Yes, he's my boy," replied Sikes, looking hard at Oliver and putting his hand abstractedly into the pocket where the pistol was. "Your father walks rather too quick for you, don't he, my man?" inquired the driver, seeing that Oliver was out of breath. "Not a bit of it," replied Sikes, interposing. "He's used to it. Here, take hold of my hand, Ned. In with you." Thus addressing Oliver, he helped him into the cart, and the driver, pointing to a heap of sacks, told him to lie down there and rest himself. As they passed the different milestones, Oliver wondered more and more where his companion meant to take him. Kensington, Hammersmith, Chiswick, Kew-Bridge, Brentford were all passed, and yet they went on as steadily as if they had only just begun their journey. At length they came to a public house called the Coach and Horses, a little way beyond which another road appeared to turn off, and here the cart stopped. Sikes dismounted with great precipitation, holding Oliver by the hand all the while and lifting him down directly, bestowed a furious look upon him and rapped the side pocket with his fist in a very significant manner. "Goodbye, boy," said the man. "He's sulky," replied Sikes, giving him a shake. "He's sulky, a young dog. Don't mind him." "Not I," rejoined the other, getting into his cart. "It's a fine day, after all," and he drove away. Sikes waited until he had fairly gone, and then telling Oliver he might look about him if he wanted, once again led him forward on his journey. They turned round to the left a short way past the public house, and then, taking a right-hand road, walked on for a long time, passing many large gardens and gentlemen's houses on both sides of the way, and stopping for nothing but a little beer until they reached a town. Here, against the wall of the house, Oliver saw written up in pretty large letters, "Hampton." They lingered about in the fields for some hours. At length they came back into the town, and turning into an old public house with a defaced signboard, ordered some dinner by the kitchen fire. The kitchen was an old low-roofed room with a grate beam across the middle of the ceiling, and benches with high backs to them by the fire, on which were seated several rough men in smock frocks, drinking and smoking. They took no notice of Oliver and very little of Sikes, and as Sikes took very little notice of them, he and his young comrades sat in a corner by themselves without being much troubled by their company. They had some cold meat for dinner, and he sat here so long after it, while Mr. Sikes indulged himself with 3 or 4 pipes, that Oliver began to feel quite certain they were not going any farther. Being much tired with the walk and getting up so early, he dozed a little at first, and then, quite overpowered by fatigue and the fumes of the tobacco, fell asleep. It was quite dark when he was awakened by a push from Sikes. Rousing himself sufficiently to sit up and look about him, he found that worthy in close fellowship and communication with a laboring man over a pint of ale. "So you're going on to Lower Halliford, are you?" inquired Sikes. "Yes, I am," replied the man, who seemed a little the worse, or better, as the case might be, for drinking. "And not slow about it, neither. My horse hasn't got a load behind him going back as he had coming up in the morning, and he won't be long a-doing it. Here's luck to him. Ecod, he's a good un." "Could you give my boy and me a lift as far as there?" demanded Sikes, pushing the ale towards his new friend. "If you're going directly, I can," replied the man, looking out of the pot. "Are you going to Halliford?" "Going on to Shepperton," replied Sikes. "I'm your man as far as I go," replied the other. "Is all paid, Becky?" "Yes, the other gentleman's paid," replied the girl. "I say," said the man with tipsy gravity, "that won't do, you know." "Why not?" rejoined Sikes. "You're going to accommodate us, and what's to prevent my standing treat for a pint or so in return?" The stranger reflected upon this argument with a very profound face, and having done so, seized Sikes by the hand and declared he was a real good fellow. To which Mr. Sikes replied he was joking, as if he had been sober, there would have been strong reason to suppose he was. After the exchange of a few more compliments, they bade the company good night and went out, the girl gathering up the pots and glasses as they did so, and lounging out to the door with her hands full to see the party start. The horse, whose health had been drunk in his absence, was standing outside, ready harnessed to the cart. Oliver and Sikes got in without any further ceremony, and the man to whom he belonged, having lingered for a minute or two to bear him up and to defy the hostler and the world to produce his equal, mounted also. Then the hostler was told to give the horse his head, and the head being given him, he made a very unpleasant use of it, tossing it into the air with great disdain, and running into the parlor windows over the way. After performing these feats and supporting himself for a short time on his hind legs, he started off at great speed and rattled out of the town right gallantly. The night was very dark. A damp mist rose from the river and the marshy ground about, and spread itself over the dreary fields. It was piercing cold, too. All was gloomy and black. Not a word was spoken, for the driver had grown sleepy, and Sikes was in no mood to lead him into conversation. Oliver sat huddled together in a corner of the cart, bewildered with alarm and apprehension, and figuring strange objects in the gaunt trees, whose branches waved grimly to and fro, as if in some fantastic joy at the desolation of the scene. As they passed Sunbury Church, the clock struck 7. There was a light in the ferry house window opposite, which streamed across the road and threw into more somber shadow a dark yew tree with graves beneath it. There was a dull sound of falling water not far off, and the leaves of the old tree stirred gently in the night wind. It seemed like quiet music for the repose of the dead. Sunbury was passed through, and they came again into the lonely road. 2 or 3 miles more, and the cart stopped. Sikes alighted, and taking Oliver by the hand, they once again walked in. They turned into no house at Shepperton, as the weary boy had expected, but still kept walking on in mud and darkness, through gloomy lanes and over cold, open wastes, until they came within sight of the lights of a town at no great distance. On looking intently forward, Oliver saw that the water was just below them, and that they were coming to the foot of a bridge. Sykes kept straight on until they were close upon the bridge, and then turned suddenly down a bank upon the left. "The water," thought Oliver, turning sick with fear. "He has brought me to this lonely place to murder me." He was about to throw himself on the ground and make one struggle for his young life, when he saw that they stood before a solitary house, all ruinous and decayed. There was a window on each side of the dilapidated entrance, and one story above, but no light was visible. It was dark, dismantled, and to all appearance uninhabited. Sykes, with Oliver's hand still in his, softly approached the low porch and raised the latch. The door yielded to the pressure, and they passed in together. Chapter 22, The Burglary. "Hello!" cried a loud, hoarse voice directly they had set foot in the passage. "Don't make such a row," said Sykes, bolting the door. "Show a glim, Toby." "Aha, my pal," cried the same voice. "A glim, Barney, a glim. Show the gentleman in, Barney, and wake up first, if convenient." The speaker appeared to throw a bootjack or some such article at the person he addressed, to arouse him from his slumbers, for the noise of a wooden body falling violently was heard, and then an indistinct muttering as of a man between asleep and awake. "Do you hear?" cried the same voice. "There's Bill Sykes in the passage, with nobody to do the civil to him, and you sleeping there as if you took laudanum with your meals and nothing stronger. Are you any fresher now, or do you want the iron candlestick to wake you thoroughly?" A pair of slipshod feet shuffled hastily across the bare floor of the room as this interrogatory was put, and there issued from the door on the right hand, first a feeble candle, and next the form of the same individual who has been heretofore described as laboring under the infirmity of speaking through his nose, and officiating as waiter at the public-house on Saffron Hill. "Mr. Sykes!" exclaimed Barney with real or counterfeit joy. "Come in, sir, come in." "Here, you get on first," said Sykes, putting Oliver in front of him. "Quicker, or I shall tread upon your heels." Muttering a curse upon his tardiness, Sykes pushed Oliver before him, and they entered a low, dark room with a smoky fire, 2 or 3 broken chairs, a table, and a very old couch, on which, with his legs much higher than his head, a man was reposing at full length, smoking a long clay pipe. He was dressed in a smartly cut, snuff-colored coat, with large brass buttons, an orange neckerchief, a coarse, staring, shawl-pattern waistcoat, and drab breeches. Mr. Crackit, for he it was, had no very great quantity of hair, either upon his head or face, but what he had was of a reddish dye, and tortured into long corkscrew curls, through which he occasionally thrust some very dirty fingers ornamented with large common rings. He was a trifle above the middle size, and apparently rather weak in the legs, but this circumstance by no means detracted from his own admiration of his top boots, which he contemplated in their elevated situation with lively satisfaction. "Bill, my boy," said this figure, turning his head toward the door, "I'm glad to see you. I was almost afraid you'd given it up, in which case I should have made a personal venture. Hallo!" Uttering this exclamation in a tone of great surprise, as his eye rested on Oliver, Mr. Toby Crackit brought himself into a sitting position and demanded who that was. "The boy, only the boy," replied Sykes, drawing a chair toward the fire. "What of Mr. Faggin's lads?" exclaimed Barney with a grin. "Fagins, huh?" exclaimed Toby, looking at Oliver. "What an invaluable boy that'll make for the old lady's pockets and chappels. His mug is a fortune to him." There's enough of that," interposed Sykes impatiently, and stooping over his recumbent friend, he whispered a few words in his ear, at which Mr. Crackit laughed immensely, and honored Oliver with a long stare of astonishment. "Now," said Sykes, as he resumed his seat, "if you'll give us something to eat and drink while we're waiting, you'll put some heart in us, or in me, at all events. Sit down by the fire, yonker, and rest yourself, for you'll have to go out with us again tonight, though not very far off." Oliver looked at Sykes in mute and timid wonder, and drawing a stool to the fire, sat with his aching head upon his hands, scarcely knowing where he was or what was passing around him. "Here," said Toby, as the young Jew placed some fragments of food and a bottle upon the table. "Success to the crack." He rose to honor the toast, and carefully depositing his empty pipe in a corner, advanced to the table, filled a glass with spirits, and drank off its contents. Mr. Sykes did the same. "A drain for the boy," said Toby, half filling a wine-glass. "Down with it, innocents." "Indeed," said Oliver, looking piteously up into the man's face. "Indeed, Down with it," echoed Toby. "Do you think I don't know what's good for you?" "Tell him to drink it, Bill." "He had better," said Sykes, clapping his hand upon his pocket. "Burn my body if he isn't more trouble than a whole family of Dodgers. Drink it, you perwerse imp, drink it." Frightened by the menacing gestures of the 2 men, Oliver hastily swallowed the contents of the glass, and immediately fell into a violent fit of coughing, which delighted Toby Crackit and Barney, and even drew a smile from the surly Mr. Sykes. This done, and Sikes having satisfied his appetite, Oliver could eat nothing but a small crust of bread, which they made him swallow. The two men laid themselves down on chairs for a short nap. Oliver retained a stool by the fire, and Barney, wrapped in a blanket, stretched himself on the floor close outside the fender. They slept, or appeared to sleep, for some time, nobody stirring but Barney, who rose once or twice to throw coals upon the fire. Oliver fell into a heavy doze, imagining himself straying along through the gloomy lanes, or wandering about the dark churchyard, or retracing some one or other of the scenes of the past day, when he was roused by Toby Crackit jumping up and declaring it was 1:30. In an instant the other two were on their legs, and all were actively engaged in busy preparation. Sikes and his companion enveloped their necks and chins in large dark shawls and drew on their greatcoats, while Barney, opening a cupboard, brought forth several articles, which he hastily crammed into the pockets. "Barkers for me, Barney," said Toby Crackit. "Here they are," said Barney, producing a pair of pistols. "You loaded them yourself." "All right," replied Toby, stowing them away. "The persuaders?" "I've got 'em," replied Sikes. "Crape, keys, center bits, darkies, nothing forgotten?" inquired Toby, fastening a small crowbar to a loop inside the skirt of his coat. "All right," rejoined his companion. "Bring them bits of timber, Barney. That's the time of day." With these words he took a thick stick from Barney's hands, who, having delivered another to Toby, busied himself in fastening on Oliver's cape. "Now then," said Sikes, holding out his hand. Oliver, who was completely stupefied by the unwonted exercise and the air and the drink which had been forced upon him, put his hand mechanically into that which Sikes held out to him for the purpose. "Take his other hand, Toby," said Sikes. "Look out, Barney." The man went to the door and returned to announce that all was quiet. The two robbers issued forth with Oliver between them. Barney, having made all fast, rolled himself up as before and was soon asleep again. It was now intensely dark. The fog was much heavier than it had been in the early part of the night, and the atmosphere was so damp that, although no rain fell, Oliver's eyes and eyebrows, within a few minutes after leaving the house, had become stiff with the half-frozen moisture that was floating about. They crossed the bridge and kept on toward the light which he had seen before. They were at no great distance off, and as they walked pretty briskly, they soon arrived at Chertsey. "Slap through the town," whispered Sikes. "There'll be nobody in the way tonight to see us." Toby acquiesced, and they hurried through the main street of the little town, which at that late hour was wholly deserted. A dim light shone at intervals from some bedroom window, and the hoarse barking of dogs occasionally broke the silence of the night. But there was nobody abroad, and they had cleared the town as the church bell struck 2. Quickening their pace, they turned up a road upon the left hand. After walking about a quarter of a mile, they stopped before a detached house surrounded by a wall, to the top of which Toby Crackit, scarcely pausing to take breath, climbed in a twinkling. "The boy next," said Toby. "Hoist him up, I'll catch hold of him." Before Oliver had time to look round, Sikes had caught him under the arms, and in 3 or 4 seconds he and Toby were lying on the grass on the other side. Sikes followed directly, and they stole cautiously toward the house. And now, for the first time, Oliver, well-nigh mad with grief and terror, saw that housebreaking and robbery, if not murder, were the objects of the expedition. He clasped his hands together and involuntarily uttered a subdued exclamation of horror. A mist came before his eyes. The cold sweat stood upon his ashy face, his limbs failed him, and he sunk upon his knees. "Get up," murmured Sikes, trembling with rage and drawing the pistol from his pocket. "Get up, or I'll strew your brains upon the grass." "Oh, for God's sake, let me go," cried Oliver. "Let me run away and die in the fields. I will never come near London, never, never. Oh, pray have mercy on me, and do not make me steal. For the love of all the bright angels that rest in heaven, have mercy upon me." The man to whom this appeal was made swore a dreadful oath, and had cocked the pistol when Toby, striking it from his grasp, placed his hand upon the boy's mouth and dragged him to the house. "Hush," cried the man. "It won't answer here. Say another word, and I'll do your business myself with a crack on the head. That makes no noise and is quite as certain and more genteel. Here, Bill, wrench the shutter open. He's game enough now, I'll engage. I've seen older hands of his age took the same way for a minute or two on a cold night." Sikes, invoking terrific imprecations upon Fagin's head for sending Oliver on such an errand, plied the crowbar vigorously, but with little noise. After some delay and some assistance from Toby, the shutter to which he had referred swung open on its hinges. It was a little lattice window, about 5.5 feet above the ground at the back of the house, which belonged to a scullery or small brewing place at the end of the passage. The aperture was so small that the inmates had probably not thought it worth while to defend it more securely, but it was large enough to admit a boy of Oliver's size nevertheless. A very brief exercise of Mr. Sykes' art sufficed to overcome the fastening of the lattice, and it soon stood wide open also. "Now listen, you young limb," whispered Sykes, drawing a dark lantern from his pocket and throwing the glare full in Oliver's face. "I'm a-going to put you through there. Take this light, go softly up the steps straight afore you and along the little hall to the street door. Unfasten it and let us in." "There's a bolt at the top you won't be able to reach," interposed Toby. "Stand upon one of the hall chairs. There are 3 there, Bill, with a jolly large blue unicorn and a gold pitchfork on 'em, which is the old lady's arms." "Keep quiet, can't you?" replied Sykes with a threatening look. "The room door's open, is it?" "Wide," replied Toby, after peeping in to satisfy himself. "The game of that is that they always leave it open with a catch so that the dog who's got a bed in there may walk up and down the passage when he feels wakeful. Ha ha, Barney ticed him away tonight. So neat." Although Mr. Crackit spoke in a scarcely audible whisper and laughed without noise, Sykes imperiously commanded him to be silent and to get to work. Toby complied by first producing his lantern and placing it on the ground, and then by planting himself firmly with his head against the wall beneath the window and his hands upon his knees, so as to make a step of his back. This was no sooner done than Sykes, mounting upon him, put Oliver gently through the window with his feet first, and without leaving hold of his collar, planted him safely on the floor inside. "Take this lantern," said Sykes, looking into the room. "You see the stairs afore you?" Oliver, more dead than alive, gasped out, "Yes." Sykes, pointing to the street door with the pistol barrel, briefly advised him to take notice that he was within shot all the way, and that if he faltered he would fall dead that instant. "It's done in a minute," said Sykes in the same low whisper. "Directly I leave go of you, do your work. Hark!" "What's that?" whispered the other man. They listened intently. "Nothing," said Sykes, releasing his hold of Oliver. Now, in the short time he had had to collect his senses, the boy had firmly resolved that whether he died in the attempt or not, he would make one effort to dart upstairs from the hall and alarm the family. Filled with this idea, he advanced at once, but stealthily. "Come back!" suddenly cried Sykes aloud. "Back! Back!" Scared by the sudden breaking of the dead stillness of the place, and by a loud cry which followed it, Oliver let his lantern fall and knew not whether to advance or fly. The cry was repeated. A light appeared. A vision of 2 terrified, half-dressed men at the top of the stairs swam before his eyes. A flash, a loud noise, a smoke, a crash somewhere, but where he knew not, and he staggered back. Sykes had disappeared for an instant, but he was up again and had him by the collar before the smoke had cleared away. He fired his own pistol after the men who were already retreating and dragged the boy up. "Clasp your arm tighter," said Sykes as he drew him through the window. "Give me a shawl there. They've hit him. Quick! Damnation, how the boy bleeds." Then came the loud ringing of a bell, mingled with the noise of firearms and the shouts of men, and the sensation of being carried over uneven ground at a rapid pace. And then the noises grew confused in the distance, and a cold, deadly feeling crept over the boy's heart, and he saw or heard no more. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 23. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.